streamed live on YouTube. You can see the URL link on your screen, and I will also share the link in the chat. This URL will also be the same link for the recording, in case you miss or would like to watch some parts over again. And with that, I pass the floor to today's moderator to kick off today's event. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to see so many of you online at this early time of the day for many of you, late time of the day for others. It's much appreciated, and we're looking forward to a great discussion. So welcome to this first high-level event ahead of the 52nd session of the UN Statistical Commission. My name's Jessica Espy. I'm a senior advisor to the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Open Data Watch, and I'm also a lecturer at the University of Bristol, and I'll be your moderator today. So we're going to be visiting the topic of data stewardship, which is an issue very much close to my own heart and something I've been researching for the last however many years. So it's a real pleasure to be able to moderate this. And we're going to be discussing how understanding of the concept has matured, particularly over the past year. And we want to mark some initial work that's been done by the high-level group for partnership, coordination and capacity building for statistics for the 2030 agenda. And for those of you that haven't had a chance yet, I'd really recommend that you have a look at the report that's been prepared by that group on this topic. It's linked to on the webpage for this event, and we can also put it in the chat because it really brings up some fascinating case studies. So the background to this topic of data stewardship is often sort of commented as the explosion in data resulting in a rapidly changing data ecosystem and ever increasing demands. And of course, these demands have meant more extensive use of private sector data and non-official data across society. And there's also been a real push for more data-driven decision-making across government. And we've really seen that with the current pandemic, which has intensified the need for better governance, better collaboration, better methods and capability, and of course, better access and understanding. So while many national statistical offices continue to prove the value of official statistics as a trusted information source, many NSOs, many of those who are on the line with us today, have started exploring a sort of expanded mandate and how they can play a broader role in this changing ecosystem. And at the 52nd session, the UNSC will consider giving a mandate to a new working group to further develop the concept of data stewardship. And therefore, we're really looking for your questions and your comments today to think about how we can drive forward this work with the aid of the entire data community. So do please be very active on the chat, and we will get to as many questions or comments as we can. So as I've mentioned, the starting point for this work is the high-level group's new report and their collection of case studies. And I'm delighted that we've got a number of the speakers who presented, a number of our speakers did present case studies to that work. As you listen to them, I'd really encourage you to look for some common themes, common questions, anything that really springs to mind across these different examples that we might want to consider in this work programme moving forward. As mentioned, we're going to be collecting up your questions and passing them along. If we don't manage to get to your question, we will, of course, attempt to tackle it in the subsequent notes summary report that will be developed after this and will inform the UNSC proceedings. So without further ado, we're going to jump straight in. We've got some amazing speakers today, and we're going to take their comments in two sections. We'll have 3 speakers first and some brief questions, and then 3 more speakers. So first, let me introduce Jean Home. Jean Home is a close friend and a wonderful advocate on this issue. She's Deputy Mayor at the City of Los Angeles. In this role, she helps over 4 million people and 500,000 businesses get access to and use data for innovation, equity, health, and safety. And she's also doesn't rest in her spare time. She founded things like the Data Science Federation, which partners universities and cities to create innovative solutions. For example, using AI for traffic safety and machine learning to improve air quality. So lots of different topics that we'd love to hear from you on, Jean, but I'm going to start by specifically asking you if you could tell us a little bit about why the City of Los Angeles has adopted a data steward approach and what that's really meant in the city. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Jess. And again, thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited about the comments and ideas that you'll have to share with us. So when we looked at from the City of Los Angeles at what was happening around data science and data, we're blessed by a mayor, Mayor Eric Garcia, who is really focused on data and technology and really uses those and science to be able to make better decisions for all of our people and businesses. So we looked at it around those 4 pillars that we really think about with collaboration, the capability, governance, and understanding. And when we think about why we adopted the data steward approach, it was because we really understood that data lives everywhere. And in order to be able to pull that data out of departments and organizations, we needed to have somebody who understood the area of expertise, like transportation or the zoo or the airport or mobility data, and be able to put that together in such a way that others could also understand it. So we created a data steward program where each department works together with various other areas in an open data ecosystem. So we have departmental folks who are focused on transportation, for example, and we partner them with students and professors at some of our Data Science Federation universities. This way we get new ideas and new technology that helps the data steward who understands the specific aspects of the data that's provided by the city. And then we also work with commercial companies, because part of the whole idea of having data is that people will consume it and use it to advocate for things that are important to them. And as a government entity, it's less important that we advocate for what we're trying to do than that we empower all 4 million of our citizens to be able to do that. And so in doing that, we create not just the data stewards inside the city, not just city staff, but we do this with our students at the universities. And we also create a training program around data liaisons. So these are people in the community who are really interested in understanding more about data and advocating for their local neighborhood. And we give them training sessions each month on new data that's being released, how to use it. And we've organized it in a way called Know Your Community that lets people use that data very specifically with maps and other things. They don't have to be a data scientist to do it, but they really focus in on their own neighborhood.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jean. Wow, that's a lots of different initiatives immediately there. Just one more question for you. So how can a data steward role help meet the kind of growing demands for more and more disaggregated data? That requires more sources, new data solutions, and so on. How has this evolved ecosystem helped you kind of crack the nut of having more disaggregated data in the city?
Well, I think the issues that we're challenged with across the globe, but certainly in the US around equity, are really important. And that's brought a huge focus on the idea of disaggregation of data. Again, by having somebody who's expert in the data sources themselves, how we're pulling that data out of sensors around the city, mobility data, data related. We're doing a project with NASA right now around air quality that you referenced earlier, Jess. And that project connects data from satellites with our smart city Internet of Things data. So data that's being collected from sensors at the airport or the Port of Los Angeles or various areas, and we're able to federate and combine those. Using machine learning, we can actually do predictive analytics. So if you're somebody who suffers from asthma, as 10% of the world's population does, then you're able to use that data in ways that can improve your health outcomes. So when we think about that sort of data, we want to think about it specific, and that data is not just about aggregated over the entirety of the city, but really specific down to your neighborhood. And so you're not wanting the aggregate data, but the specific data. The other thing that we've learned too is that it's really important to be able to focus on how people get access to that data. So when we think about the disaggregation, it helps understand equity at a neighborhood level, but also the ability to be able to put data together and give access to that data for different people. One of the things we've learned during COVID, for example, is that having the aggregate data, as many people did originally, of like state level data in California, that's over 33 million people, that is not as helpful as knowing the specific risk factor for a specific geography. And so we want to disaggregate that data so we can act upon it in better ways. And at the same time, as we're distributing vaccines, the city has got the country's largest mass vaccination center at Dodger Stadium. We wanted to make sure that the distribution of that is also equitable. And so when we disaggregate the data and we look specifically across ethnicity, age, vulnerability, essential workers, the ability for us to now have put in mobile clinics that go into the communities where it's most difficult for people to get access to some of these larger areas, go to their homes, go to the nursing homes, and be able to get the vaccine there. It's because we disaggregate the data and we work with this open data ecosystem of trying to get folks together in different ways to come up with new solutions.
Jean, amazing. Thank you so much. I think your point about this isn't just about disaggregating data so we have more and more, greater detail. It's fundamentally about equity, and therefore access is crucial. This is about making sure that everyone can actually use and understand this information. So thank you. Some brilliant points there. We are going to jump on now to our next speaker, Pam Dixon, but I very much hope you'll all be thinking of questions to put to our speakers, and do pop them in the chat. So yes, delighted to welcome Pam from the World Privacy Forum. Pam is the founder and executive director of the World Privacy Forum, which is a respected public interest research group. She's the author and research. She's an author and researcher and has written influential studies in the areas of privacy, identity, biometrics, artificial intelligence, health privacy, and many other topics, which I can't do justice to. And she has another book set to be published next year, I believe. So very deeply steeped in this topic. So Pam, welcome. If I could just kick off with another question. Pam, I'd love to hear from you on how you think a data steward can ensure quality control and the proper use of privately held data, which is of course a burning question for many people in this current debate. So over to you.
Oh, well, thank you. It's the question really that has to be asked. So I'm going to contextualize that question just a bit. So I think that a lot of these topics that we're going to talk about today are topics that we've discussed for several decades, right? But the pandemic has been a really tough teacher, I think, globally. And one of the first things we discovered is that our data ecosystem, the things that we've known all along about interoperability, the need for long-term work on data standardization, the need for having appropriate guardrails for the data, all of this bubbled up in a horrifying way that has shown us where all of the cracks are. And so the role of national statistics offices really is set to expand and change and grow if that's the direction that jurisdictions want to go. And that's really the question is, okay, how can we utilize all of the expertise that NSOs have developed over many decades and utilize that for broader purposes? And this, to me, is where the entire idea of data stewardship really comes in. So I wanted to talk about a couple of different things as I was thinking about this topic. One is data numeracy. One of the things that has really been brought to light from the pandemic is the lack of numeracy generally outside of statistical offices, both within government and within, I would say, more micro ecosystems such as neighborhoods and communities. And there are big pockets of expertise, but really large areas where the data never flows to. So we really need a steward who is going to ensure that data is not extractive, that data goes back to the communities. I'm really heartened to hear Jean Holmes' description of what she's doing in Los Angeles. It's very exciting, and there are very, very few programs like that in the world. But in terms of what happens with this data, I think one of the important things is that we are now in a predictive era. And even amidst this pandemic, we're seeing that we need properly formatted and interoperable health data at a very micro level. And we also need proper guardrails for that data. And that is where data protection comes in. And I know that Drudisha Madhub is here, one of the best data protection authorities in the entire world. So she can talk more about that. But what I'll say is this. In the past, there has been the idea that open data and data protection are somehow at odds or have this adversarial relationship. And it's extraordinarily important to release that ideology and to move forward, understanding that we really need to have a cooperative relationship. Data lives in ecosystems and very complex ecosystems today. And data governance has to be in place for the consumers of data and those who are having their data utilized. All of the stakeholders in the data ecosystem have to trust the ecosystem. That's where data governance and data protection comes in. So my view of this is that the job before NSOs and also data protection authorities, and for governments that don't have a data protection authority, whomever is in charge, whichever ministry or agency, it's incredibly important that it's a harmonized relationship and very deeply cooperative to utilize data properly, to disaggregate it properly and respectfully and carefully, because sometimes data disaggregation can lead to very, very bad outcomes, and sometimes it can lead to very, very good outcomes, and the division line is quite narrow. And so we have to have deep statistical knowledge and deep legal knowledge and deep policy and data flow knowledge to get all of these together. So I think that a deeply cooperative approach is quite necessary. And I must add, you know, sometimes when I hear folks talk about data, it's just about the data, but really, again, data lives in systems, and we've got to employ systems thinking at a global level to really address some of these problems. And thinking like a data fiduciary just simply means we're going to work cooperatively so that we can use data and have good data governance all at the same time.
Great, thank you so much, Pam. You covered sort of a wide range of issues there, but yeah, absolutely fascinating. Couldn't agree more that we need to focus on, yeah, as you said, equity, a cooperative approach, not being in kind of tension or odds with all the different data stakeholders and communities. And I think one of the things I was going to ask you, but I think you've sort of already answered it, is, you know, what do you think is fundamental for a data steward to be kind of communicating to external data producers outside of the public sector or government? But it sounds like it's very much cooperation.
Yes, and also I think that there's a gap that I didn't talk about, and we can address it a bit more later. But there's, in data protection language and data governance language, usually the architecture of that is quite broad, and there has to be a way that those principles or high-level language are brought into the real world, and that gap between that is really codes of conduct, best practices, and not so much self-regulation, because that's difficult to enforce, but the codes of conduct idea is incredibly important for stakeholders within smaller municipalities, within, you know, segments of jurisdictions or even communities, to figure out how to best implement all of these things. And it's really training of an entire community. I really like the idea of having community level experts that have knowledge about how to do this and to share this. At some point, hopefully within a decade or two, everyone will have really good understanding of what it means to be a data fiduciary, both of their own data and others.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Pam. And yeah, a really good point there, that a lot of this is very high level, highfalutin conversation and jargon and technical legal speak. And actually, we need to make these issues much more accessible and understandable for the general public. And I mean, I think the pandemic has done that to some degree. There's certainly a lot more awareness of many of these concerns, but a lot more could be done. Great. Well, we're now going to jump onto our third speaker, who's Rusenga Maluleke, who's a statistician general from South Africa. And Rusenga, we would absolutely love to hear about South Africa's experiences, particularly with regards to some of these kind of concerns and issues that have already been raised by Pam and Jean. Just a bit more context, Rusenga was appointed South Africa's second Statistician General in November 2017. Prior to this, he was the Deputy Director General for Statistical Collections and Outreach, and has worked with Statistics SA for the past 20 years, as well as with the UN Statistical Commission for a very long time. So he's very familiar to many of you, I'm sure. So Rusenga, can you tell us a bit about what have the experiences been of Statistics South Africa with regards to this kind of new evolving role of data stewards within the ecosystem? So over to you.
Thank you indeed, Jessica, and greetings to friends and colleagues. For starters, it's as if we knew that you were going to cause this discussion one day. About a year ago, we started putting in place our data stewardship approach in our strategy. So our 5-year strategy for Stats SA had to do with defining our role within that data stewardship. And we said we want to improve lives through the data ecosystem. And it's quite interesting because in doing so, one of the things we had to deal with is to map out the country's data demands and supply. And indeed, when you look at the whole issue of demand-driven data sources from NSOs, it means that you put in place the relevance of your users in the end. You start with them and you finish with them in the end. But the ecosystem is very interesting, Jessica, in that it has to have somehow, it has to have predators in it. You have to have those that must supply the data and the like, those that must produce the data, those who must use the data. But the predatory nature means that those who must survive must stay at the top echelon of the ecosystem, because otherwise, if you don't stay at the top echelon, you will disappear. And this is the challenge that we are facing as NSOs going forward in our countries, especially with the challenges that we are facing. So we need to define the roles quite clearly. We need to know who will play what, and the roles can change easily. A supplier can find themselves being a key user of data, and a key user of data may find themselves being a producer of data. So that statistical value chain is very critical. The COVID-19 environment gave us an opportunity to put in place our strategy that looks at the entire ecosystem, because we had to start looking at health, economic and social data. And in doing so, we had to interface with the private sector. So both public and private sector data had to be put in place and for purposes of decision making. And I'm talking about rapid decision making. And when you want to make decisions in such a state where you are pressurized and lives are being lost and you need to make evidence-based decisions, then you need a statistical agency that understands how to balance out the need for the methods and the traditional methods that we have, as well as new and emerging methods that are put in place by the restrictive nature of COVID-19, and as such, respond speedily to the user needs. And in that, properly place yourself at the center of the data ecosystem, and thus drive your data stewardship. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Senga. Exactly. I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, which is that the NSO has to kind of evolve into this mediator or broker, if you will, who's going to kind of balance the rigor and quality of official statistics and the value and expediency of some of these new approaches and methods and some of these new partners. So absolutely fascinating. And as you said, and as other speakers have said, I think COVID has kind of brought this to a head. Tragically, but also in many ways it's created an opportunity for this to sort of move faster than ever before. Rasenga, are there any other functions that you've noticed that Statistics South Africa has kind of taken on as part of this broader ecosystem management role? Are there any other things that spring to mind that you think have been crucial in playing this new role over the last year?
Well, one of the things that you come into contact with, Jessica, my apologies, sometimes coughs these days can worry even colleagues who are remotely connected. But what we're looking at is the whole issue of quality. And quality becomes very critical, especially when you are working in a space where data is needed here and now for decision making. It's unlike in a space where we used to conduct censuses as NSOs in about 20, 30 years ago, and we could spend 2 years before the results. The COVID-19 environment placed us in a state where we had to make sure that we have data here and now and make it available. So quality plays a very critical role. And one of the things we have and we are housing at Stats SA is what we call the South African Quality Assessment Framework. it is a long process. And for COVID-19, we had to actually rehabilitate it to be what we call SASCAF Light, South African Quality Assessment Framework, that can move speedily in terms of support for decisions that need to be taken. While I must admit, it hasn't been put to the extreme test in terms of the situation that we're dealing with in the COVID-19 environment. Over time, it will be put to test. So what do you need to deal with that? At the beginning, when you are bringing everyone on board, especially key partners who are used to operating in their own space, you don't need to be quite hard on rules. You need to be soft on rules. And as you become soft on rules, but you need to adhere to certain standards, because for quality, you need to adhere to certain standards. And as such, when you have everyone getting on board, when you have buy-in, when people understand what it is that is in there for them, then you start saying, can we define our rules a lot more better? Can we be a lot more harder on ourselves on rules and standards? And in this regard, one of the things we emerged with private sector and other key players was an observatory that goes beyond the role of the NSO, but places the entire system of national statistics into practice.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Senga. I'd love to keep asking you questions about the observatory, but I'm mindful of time. So I do want to sort of bring this back to a collective discussion of our three speakers who jumped in today. So between you, you've highlighted a real host of really important issues. You've focused on equity being a major concern in this new data ecosystem, collaboration being absolutely paramount, the accessibility of this discussion and this debate, the fact that, you know, it might be happening within the UN Statistical Commission, but how do we bring this to communities and make sure they understand these issues as well? Rosenga, you've talked about the necessity for data stewards to kind of think about mapping supply and demand of data and staying abreast of kind of the changing data ecosystem, and also your point just now about quality control being absolutely critical. So that's a lot of functions for evolving national statistical offices to have to grapple with. So can I put a slightly tricky question to all three of you and ask, you know, what do you think is the most important function of a data steward in this kind of evolved ecosystem, and particularly of an NSO as it sort of potentially looks to become that data steward role? So maybe I will jump to you first, Jean. Sorry to put you on the spot, but would love any thoughts, reflections you have on that.
Sure. So I think you can look at the data steward role in a couple of different ways. And I think people tend to either think policy or technology. But in Los Angeles, we really like folks who can do both, a little bit of both. And to some of the items that Pam was talking about, I think you need to have somebody who has an understanding of the data, can disaggregate it, can help others to use it, but also understands the issues around data privacy and protection. As you get more and more data accessible and available, have data sensors and the Internet of Things, machine learning, it's amazing what we have available to us. At the same time, the aggregation, we talked about disaggregation, but the aggregation of that data can also be revealing about people's personal lives and their privacy. So a steward should be just the thing we call them, a steward, somebody who understands, protects, nurtures, and grows that data. And we're looking for somebody who can do that both from a technical perspective, so not somebody who has to write the API, but somebody who understands about that, and from a policy and protection perspective. And I think those are the things we want to be able to do. And most important, somebody who can figure out how to collaborate with folks, and to Rasinga's point, to non-traditional folks, right? People who are going to consume and use that data.
Jean, very succinctly put, and very compelling point there. Yeah, exactly. That you need people that need to be able to speak to sort of both sides of this debate and broker between the two, often quite parallel discussions, unfortunately. Great. Okay, Pam, over to you. What would you say is the kind of key function that you're seeing in this evolving ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think that we really have to look, there's a couple of things. If I can just put it as an overarching thing, there really has to be cooperation between, I think, three very distinct types of experts. I would say data level experts, like micro level data experts who deal with the standards and the formatting of the data to make sure that it's fully interoperable. And I think the other group is, of course, the more of the analytical folks who are doing the predictive analytics and the machine learning on the data, determining the fit of the data and whatnot, as well as this the scoping of all of that. And then, of course, you've got the data protection and data governance side. And really, these are now, at our point in history, very deep areas of expertise. So instead of having one entity try to have expertise in all of those things, we've got to have a really good, repeatable, dependable way of coordinating and being cooperative. And I think being a data steward in this day and age means understanding how to really gather these points of deep expertise and then, create guardrails around each so as to then eventually, of course, really protect the entire ecosystem or set of ecosystems at hand.
Great, thank you so much, Pam. I do hope we're going to get a chance to come back to your repeated point about guardrails and kind of safety and protection, because we haven't quite jumped into that yet. So I hope it will come up in our subsequent discussion. Rusenga, any reflections from you on kind of what is the really paramount function of this data steward role? Oh, Rusenga, we can't hear you. Do you want to just unmute quickly?
My apologies. One of the things we need to look at, it's not a matter of big and grand strategies we need to put in place. It's a matter of tactics. Politicians talk about value, strategy, and tactics. Now, in the process of the tactics we need to deploy, we need to demonstrate the value for all the key players. And that value must be demonstrated a lot more earlier. Because once they understand the value, then they know what is it that they are coming to get in this bandwagon. One of the things, and I think it's Pam who raised that, is the whole issue of putting in place governance structures. And when you put in place governance structures, you make sure that everyone who comes to the party and every data aspect and attribute that you get is managed within certain levels of governance, so that those who make available data and those who use it do understand that it cannot be abused. I mean, one of the things we uphold in the area of official statistics is the whole issue of confidentiality. But on the other hand, one of the lessons we have learned with COVID-19 is that you needed to reach out to people, specifically those that have tested positive, especially in the early cases. You need to track them down and know who they have come into contact with. So the whole issue of confidentiality is relative in this regard. Obviously, you have to distance yourself as an official stats agency in breaking confidentiality, but supplying enough data so that those who must be able to do their work are able to do their work and lives get saved. The last thing that we need to look at is that we cannot win everyone at once. So we should not think that we need to get everyone in the bandwagon at once. We need to focus on those that are willing to be part and parcel of making the data stewardship a success. And out of those, then we expand our tentacles. But not only that, we also have more ambassadors who make it a lot more easier and make people understand that data and data stewardship is not the role of the NSO alone, but it's the role of the entire system of national statistics, and broadly, the system of global statistics as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Rusenga. Very good point that, we can't expect the same level of cooperation from such a broad diversity of actors so quickly. So this is going to be a progressive kind of movement, if you will. We've had some great questions come in online, so I'd like to just take a couple of those and then we're going to move to our next set of speakers. And happily, both sets of questions relate to the sort of crux of the data privacy issue, which I wanted to come back on. So the first question, which I think I'm going to put to Pam, is from the colleague in India, the Indian NSO. So thank you for your question. And it's, how does a data steward minimize the balance between various extents of data privacy, information fiduciary roles, and transparency? So, how does a data steward maintain this careful balance between getting the information that we need in its timely fashion as possible, whilst also managing these other constraints? Pam's internet looks like it's just gone down. I think it has. So yeah, so I'm going to actually throw this question to Jean first. Sorry, Jean, to put you on the spot.
That's okay. So I think the challenge becomes one in which we, again, are trying to open more and more data. We're seeing a proliferation of technologies in use by the private sector and even by individual citizens. I mean, think how easy it is to buy a drone that lets you take aerial photography, which can seem perfectly harmless, but in fact, if you use facial recognition on that, or if you use license plate recognition, you can suddenly start, getting a little bit nefarious. So I think the idea of having, sort of mores and values and community standards is important, but more important is to have actual regulations around how people can use some of this data in ways that help to protect people's privacy. At the same time, we want to make sure that as much data as possible is open, at least from the government's perspective, so that people can innovate and advocate and learn more, and that we can be a transparent and appropriate government. I think one of the things we've done, and just a shout out to the Sustainable Development Solutions Network and Trends, who've been good partners with Los Angeles in this, created in Los Angeles an SDG portal that we've adopted the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework in LA to help us start to understand some of these more complex and global issues, more holistic issues. And behind that portal, you can click on any one of the 17 goals and be able to see the actual data that we're collecting that shows how we're getting towards equity and measurement. And part of that helps us to understand, when we're gathering data that helps to look at gender equity, then how are we doing it in such a way as to protect individual privacy while moving society forward into a more equitable way? So I think the idea of using the SDGs as a framework is really important and critical for our work, even as a city. I mean, I know normally countries adopt that, but many cities have started to adopt it because it's just a really useful framework in helping to understand some of these issues.
Jean, I'm biased because I've worked on the SDGs for a long time now, but I think that's a wonderful approach, as I'm sure of many on the line. So using the SDGs as kind of a framework for what the government can communicate at the local or national level, and being as open and transparent as possible, but whilst also putting in place these regulations and standards about what is or isn't acceptable with regards to particularly micro data. We've had another comment and good question from a colleague in New Zealand, Craig Jones, who's pointed out that in New Zealand, where there's a very mature stewardship model, they had a specific case where some colleagues, some Indigenous partners and partner organisations were looking for data on individual and houses in order to be able to help their people, specifically in the context of COVID. And the question is it kind of appropriate and relevant for a data steward like an NSO or the equivalent at a different scale of government to be facilitating access to that kind of data? Or is it necessary to always have that slightly higher level of aggregation so that we respect people's privacy? How do you balance the need for highly disaggregated data in order to be able to respond quickly and effectively, whilst also maintaining, confidentiality and privacy and so on? So I'm going to ask Reshenga your experiences of this tension in South Africa, and I hope Pam will rejoin us soon, because I'd love her views too before we jump on to our next speakers. Thanks, Reshenga, over to you.
The things that we must appreciate is a situation where, in the world of official statistics and in creating a broader statistical society where all actors can come into being and assist in decision making, is that official statistics must exist side by side with other data sources. And this became, and the COVID-19 environment, like the case in New Zealand for housing, becomes very critical, because official statistics will then use aggregates to demonstrate to you where the need is, and in long term, not only now for COVID, but in long term, because we can look at the data in perspective, in historical perspective. And out of that, then you then bring in the aspect of administrative data. Data that gets collected on daily basis because of the need, and in the case of New Zealand, the need for housing during COVID-19 is because these cases were emerging on daily basis. And such administrative records, which may be sitting with the Department of Housing and Human Settlement in different countries, but also may be sitting with local municipalities in the wake of COVID-19, where they know who is affected and who is not affected. When you marry the two, you emerge with a solid basis where the role of the NSO is not undermined, and it's actually more kind of given prominence in shedding the light where challenges are. Whereas the role of administrative records is to actually go into detail and deal with matters of beyond confidentiality. And that's why you need actors, different actors. The NSO, which upholds the issues of privacy and confidentiality, and the line department or ministry or municipality that wants to talk to real people. Because in the end, no matter how much we talk about aggregates, those numbers are about people. And when issues of life matter, as we have seen and we continue to see in COVID-19, all of us must bring our hands to the deck and work together. Thanks.
Thanks, Usenga. I really like that point that, as the NSO, your job is not necessarily to facilitate to really micro-level access data to respond to a particular issue. It's to take that long-term stance on this is the kind of data we need to use for long-term planning and recovery and so on. But by all means, to facilitate connections to other actors, ministries, administrative data departments, or third-party actors who might be able to provide access to that kind of level of detail, but with some very clear parameters on how that should be done. So nicely put. Pam is back. We have 1 minute left before we need to jump on to the next session. But Pam, we were about to come to you when, unfortunately, your internet seemed to go down. So, okay. So we'd love to just hear from you about, how does a data steward manage this balance between data privacy and but also and transparency, essentially, the 2 points you raised before that are often seen as being at odds. But how do they, practically speaking, actually juggle this day to day?
Right. So, yikes. Are you getting an echo?
We are.
Okay, I'm going to mute myself and try to fix this.
All right, what we'll do is, poor Pam is having technological challenges. Pam, I think you might be logged on twice, which might be the issue. We're going to jump to the next panel, but I think I'm going to come back to you when we have the subsequent discussion. Okay, so we'll move on to our next few speakers.
I think I've got it.
Oh, you have.
I have. I figured it out. Okay, so just very, very quickly. Oh, hang on. I'm just going to mute myself. We'll come back.
Okay, Pam, I will come back to you in the next session. I think we should jump on now, if that's all right. So, okay, great. All right, thank you. So I'm going to turn now to one of our colleagues from Ireland. Patrick Dalton's on the line. Patrick is the Director General of the Central Statistics Office of Ireland and was appointed to the role of Director General there in May 2012. So he's been in the role for quite a while over this kind of evolving transition or ecosystem. So I think has a really good long-term perspective of how it's unfolding in Ireland. Patrick is a career statistician, having joined the CSO in 1991. And is very involved as well in the European Statistical System Committee, which obviously sets standards and professional guidance for the European statistical system. So operating at lots of different levels. So Patrick, you've heard a lot of the discussion already, a lot of themes have come up. What's really resonating with you from kind of your experiences in Ireland and the Central Statistical Office's day-to-day challenges with this new ecosystem?
Hi Jessica, and many thanks for the invitation to talk. I suppose if I think about it really at a high level, the role of NSIs really in many respects is evolving. And in Ireland, we are certainly changing the way we're seeing ourselves. I suppose traditionally, we had seen ourselves as compilers of data and statistics, but that's changing now in that we no longer just compile data and statistics. We now also need to evolve into the provision of statistical services. And that's very much I suppose the extension from the traditional role into what we would see as a data stewardship role. And I think very much having spoken to a lot of colleagues about a data stewardship role, there are different views on what a data steward is. But for us, what's really important is you have to understand your mandate. You obviously have to adhere to your core values. But what's particularly important is the national context. The maturity of the data ecosystem in your own country, I think, reflects the scale and how far you can go as a data steward in your own organization. So I think that's really important. One of the things we've been very conscious of in Ireland is being very clear about what we can do as an NSI in a data stewardship role, what we can facilitate others to do. And that's slightly different, but by us applying our expertise around data classifications, data governance, national data infrastructures, and I suppose broadening that out across the system, you improve the understanding of data, not just within the NSI, but right across the system. And therefore you create opportunities for others to help themselves by, I suppose, helping them to understand how to extract the insight from their data. So I think that's a very, very important distinction. And the other thing we're very clear about in Ireland is what we're not going to do, because there are certain things, and I think Rasinga touched on this, there are certain things that we can't do and we shouldn't do because of the fact that we are a trusted third party. NSIs, I think, have a particular standing and we're trusted by users. So why do we need to evolve our role? And it's because, very simply, the demand for data and insight is growing rapidly across a whole range of areas. And the truth is that you can't provide the insight now anymore from primary data sources. You have to look at secondary data sources, which incorporates administrative data and also private data. And it's not just getting access to those data sources, it's actually about integrating and blending those data sources so you can extract the real insight. But you have to do it in a way that satisfies data privacy, data protection, and that's where the data governance piece comes in. So what we're really focused on is the systematic implementation of common standards right across the system. And we're focusing, I suppose, in Ireland at the moment on the administrative data. Part of that for us is about, if you're going to use these data sources to provide insight for decision makers, quality is key. And therefore, we need to influence data quality and data governance right across the administrative system. So right across all the ministries and departments and the public sector bodies in Ireland or across any national statistical system or in the broader data ecosystem, you have to try and play a leadership role there. And I think, if we play this role properly and we do it right, I think we won't just support better data analytics, we'll actually support better data governance. And if you think about it, if the NSI doesn't step up and play this role, somebody else will. And the benefit of the NSI doing it, the National Statistical Institute doing it, is that we're trusted, we're objective, we don't have any agenda, we're totally objective. We have a lot of experience and competence in managing data and managing data protection. And we also have strong legislation backing things like access to data, but also making it a legal guarantee on confidentiality, that we can't breach confidentiality. So I think all of those things are really important. So if we don't step in, somebody else may well step into that role who may not have the experience or the legislative backing. So just very simply, I suppose some of the specific things we've done is we've been directly involved in drafting the public service data strategy in Ireland. And our focus there was about developing a data ecosystem that was designed not just for operations, but also for data analytics. And that's been really, really important. We have a number of actions came out of that, and the CSO, we're leading those actions right across the public service now in collaboration with our partners and the custodians of administrative data. So it's a collaborative effort whereby we're trying to improve the data holdings for all purposes. You can develop classifications, you can develop methodologies, you can develop national data infrastructures and write lovely rules and policies, but just handing them out doesn't mean they'll be implemented. So you actually have to, what we've done is we've started to embed professional statisticians in government departments around the system. And that ensures, or not ensures, but it helps this idea of the systematic implementation of common standards, which we feel is really, really important. Touching on something Rasinga said, it's about value. So very often people who aren't dealing with data every day, they don't see the value of some of the things around data governance or data infrastructure or data classifications that we see. So what we do is we've identified pathfinder projects with the policy departments and said, look, you have a policy challenge there, work with us. Let's get access to the relevant data sources, and we can highlight to you how we can make the data, how we can extract the insight from the data through the data infrastructures, through common classifications, etc. And in a sense there, you're providing a proof of concept for a lot of that. The other part that we're doing is we're providing broader data services then as well. So for example, in the recent COVID-19 situation in Ireland, the Ministry for Health came to us and said, we've a range of data sources, but we don't really know how to integrate them, how to use it, how to extract the insight. So they asked us to take the data sources, to link them, and then we have subsequently given those data sources back to the modeling team who are producing the R numbers and the incidence rates for COVID-19 by accessing remote microdata files through our legislative framework. And that, in a way, is really facilitating all the key analysis for COVID-19 in Ireland. So we've created what we call a COVID-19 hub, a data hub, and that's another type of that's a new service that we're providing, and we want to kind of grow that service out across the system. And by doing it in a collaborative way like that, in a way that's strong in data governance, I think we can add an awful lot of value. So that's really all I wanted to say at this stage, but happy to take questions afterwards. Jessica.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And I was going to ask you about specific functions you're covering, but I think you've laid out really well there. A really broad range of activities and ways that you're reinventing yourself to show your new purpose and functions. And that last point is interesting because no one else has raised it, that you're kind of coming back to the government and the public sector and the other third-party actors to say, actually, we provide a service, which is kind of being able to help you understand these third-party data sets, these other data insights, and extract the most valuable insights from them whilst ensuring quality control and so on. So that's, yeah, really interesting. And I think a very compelling offering for, a lot of NSOs around the world. So great, fascinating stuff. Thank you so much, Patrick. We'll come back to you in the discussion. I want to turn now to welcome Judesha Merhab. Judesha is the Data Protection Commissioner at the Data Protection Office Mauritius and has been since 2007. She has a legal professional background, practicing for more than 6 years at the Attorney General's Office at State Council prior to becoming Commissioner. Judesha is also a member of lots of international networks and has published a lot on issues around data protection and privacy. So she's probably very well known to many of you already, but it's a real pleasure to have her with us today to hear about your experiences nationally, but also your expertise in this area of kind of balancing the new emerging demands and the privacy and protection constraints that are coming up. So, Judesha, I'd love to hear, just quite simply to begin with, what is the role of a kind of data protection officer in this new data ecosystem?
Okay, thank you so much, Jessica. It's really a pleasure to be around with you to discuss this very important aspect of data disaggregation, data stewardship. For me personally, because I will be talking from a data protection perspective, data stewardship, as you know, goes beyond statistical information and data disaggregation. So when we see data stewardship, obviously we see it very much from a holistic perspective, and we want all data protection principles to be incorporated in any such data governance framework. For instance, in Mauritius, we have developed our national data governance framework since some time already. And it's like a code of practice which has been developed in collaboration with the Data Protection Office. And we have also shared that document with you. You can have a look. We have put many elements of data protection in that framework, which means that compliance with data protection here is very seriously taken. And we have actually explained who is a data custodian, who is a data user, who is the controller, who is the data steward, and what are the different functions of all these people around, and what type of cooperation is required from each and every one of them to make it a success. And it concerns any information dealing with in the public sector, including statistical information. But I would also like to say, when I talk about compliance, this is where the role of the data protection officer becomes very critical. In our law, a data protection officer is mandatorily appointed by every organization in Mauritius, public or private sector included, which means that if it is not respected, it's a breach of the Data Protection Act and it's an offense under our law, as serious as this. What does this mean? Is that when you have a data protection officer in your organization, it's actually facilitating the balance to be made between privacy, data protection, and data management. So in the data steward, for example, will have to look up to the data protection officer to be able to assess how compliance is being affected with data protection. And that data protection officer actually reports to us, the data protection office, as to any issues which is happening. For example, I'll give you a very concrete one. Like there's a data breach incident in an organization. The data protection officer has to notify the data protection office about this incident within 72 hours. And if you look at international standards around data protection, let's say the EU General Data Protection Regulation, Convention 108 Plus of Council of Europe, which are actually the main international standards in vogue right now in this area. So they actually recommend that a data protection officer has to be appointed. So basically, when we have a data protection officer, the worries of the organization relating to data management will reduce to a level which is going to be very manageable within the organization. So it's a must to have such a type of an officer. Now we also talk about, we have published a small guide on the role of a data protection officer, which has been shared to you as well, where we make it very clear that there shouldn't be any conflict of interest between, let's say, the functions of a data steward and the functions of a data protection officer. Because here we're talking about independence. Data protection compliance is also relating to transparency in the process and actually seeing that compliance is the most important thing. So independence of the functions of a data protection officer is very important. So we want this officer to be able to work in a very healthy fashion and not subject to the pressures of the organization to defeat compliance. So basically for us, it's very important that let's say in the national statistical perspective, this respect for the functions of the data protection officer is visible. Otherwise we come into play and we take action. So here I would say, here the controller, as we say in the data protection jargon, is the director of statistics office, for example. He has a number of obligations already in our law relating to data protection, and that has been incorporated in the data governance framework. For instance, when he's dealing with a large-scale data, which has not been completely anonymized, which relate indirectly to people, which is also happening. As you know, data disaggregation is good, but data anonymization is not always a foolproof and 100% effective. So we can still think about data being, used in a way that can harm people or prejudice people, for example. So the purpose is that a data protection impact assessment, for example, what we say that you need to do an assessment to see whether there are high risk to people involved in the process, and that eliminate, slowly and gradually all the negative impacts relating to people's data. So basically, this is what I wanted to talk about, unless you have other questions, and I will definitely jump in and go exactly on the sections that our Data Protection Act provides, for example, if you want to know. So here we are. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judetta. And Mauritius is such a fabulous example of a country that's taken this very seriously and really shown how it can be implemented at lots of different, different organizational scales and so on. And I think you've talked a little bit there about how these functions translate into the National Statistical Office, but I hope we can come back to that point again in terms of, I think you've established that the NSO has got to be crucial in setting the standards and the regulations and the laws with the government to, for example, create these protection officers. But it would be interesting to know internally what it means, practically speaking, as well, for sort of the day-to-day operations of the Statistical Office in the context of the broader system. Anyway, we'll come back to that shortly because I'm cognizant of time, and I want to turn to our third and final speaker, who is Julio Santella, who's the president of the Mexican National Institute of Statistics and Geography, which is INEGI, which many of you may know by its shorter name. From 2001 to 2015, Mr. Santella served at the Bank of Mexico and has also worked in academia as a researcher and teacher at the ITAM. He's also been an economist at the European Department of the International Monetary Fund, so has had a very broad and prolific career in quite a few different fields. And I think it's going to be really interesting to hear from you, Mr. Santella, about kind of the policy and politics of all of this. So anyway, I would love to hear first and foremost, what has been the experience of INEGI with regards to these issues that we've raised thus far? Is INEGI itself kind of evolving to serve broader functions? And what are some of the challenges you've encountered in doing that? So over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. And it's a pleasure to be here, and especially after very distinguished speakers and my colleagues, Risenga and Padraig, which have already said many of the issues involving national statistical offices. Just a little bit of background. INEGI has a dual role, both in terms of being a coordinator of the national statistical system and also being a producer of statistics. And it also has a dual sphere of action, because we deal both with statistics and with geography. So that puts us in the middle of a lot of the aspects of the data ecosystem. Now, it's important to recognize what is our mandate. Our mandate is to provide statistics and geography to help decision-making, especially for public policy, but also for overall society. That means that we have to provide a service, and that statistics and geography have to be a public good in terms of what economists say, that it's a social asset. It has to be good for everyone. It has to be valuable. And in order to do that, we have to be very careful of all the institutional settings, the governance, and the process through which we provide this service. Now, the last years, INEGI has been focused a lot on the process. And basically, we're adopting our own version of the GSBPM that was developed by UNSC. And that has been very important in recognizing the life cycle of data that we deal with. And I think this life cycle is very important for a data steward, because the data starts, I mean, from a statistical point of view, the data starts with the individual. And it has to come through a process of collection, processing, and fit for purpose analysis, in order that in the end, this individual data reflects a society or certain geography that we want to relate to. So we have to make sure that it adheres to certain infrastructures, to certain data standards or quality standards, so that this data actually is meaning, has meaning. So in this data cycle process, then we have to understand that we have to deal with individual data and protect the confidentiality of that data, so that we remain a trusted third party, so that informants can share the data with us, and later in the life cycle, they can be provided with the service through which all this data has been aggregated to a certain degree, that their privacy is protected, but their data is still very useful in order to make certain decisions. So this whole process approach, emphasizing the quality of data, looking at the life cycle of data from the start to the use of the data, is very important for data stewardship, and basically lays down many of the different aspects that we have to take care in order to provide a very good service in this respect. Of course, the recent COVID-19 pandemic has basically raised up and made very evident the need to be very careful of all the life cycle of the data regarding all the infections and now the vaccination and all this. And NSOs in many countries play a crucial role in this respect, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Julio. Great remarks. And yes, I think it's nice to sort of take a step back and reflect on the fact that there is this sort of life cycle of data, of how it's produced and curated and analysed and so on. And the NSO really has to work across the whole breadth of those functions that the National Statistical System does, which is, you know, a much broader mandate than many other actors in this arena, and do so carefully to maintain that sort of trusted third-party actor role. One of the things that I wanted to ask you specifically, I'll start with you and then I'm going to open it up to our other speakers, is particularly in the context of COVID, have there been many requests and demands on INEGI for more disaggregated data, specifically to help respond to the pandemic? You know, have you noticed more and more pressure on INEGI to kind of provide more disaggregated, timely data and information systems for the government?
Absolutely, Jessica. The dynamics of the pandemic are place-specific. So the pandemic goes where humans go. I mean, so we really need to have a very good understanding of mobility, and that requires geospatial information on a time basis. So we understand how people are interacting with each other. And that has made a lot of demands regarding specific geographies, small disaggregated data on certain communities, and highlighting certain aspects that are very important in health policy, such as the density of population, the availability of certain public or services, such as health services, and so on and so forth, that are very important in this particular context.
Fascinating. I would love to have time to speak to all of you about this, because I think it's so interesting to see the kinds of demands that are being placed upon all of your offices and the system at large in the context of this crisis. But aware again that we don't have that much time. Just going to jump to some of our other speakers as well now. A question that has been sort of, you know, cutting through all of this discussion now has been, what's the role of the data steward in ensuring quality control and the proper use of privately held data? So we've sort of alluded to it many times, but if you are planning on using, if the government or any other actor is asking the NSO to use this private data and extract insights, how do you balance that kind of quality control and privacy when you're using third-party information? Patrick, you referred to offering this service previously. Did you want to share any reflections on this?
Yeah, I think to be quite honest with you, Jessica, it's much easier, I think, and there's a lot more experience in the world of official statistics when we're talking about the quality of administrative data. And also that's because there's a relationship where public sector agencies, and actually in Ireland there's a law that says if you're a public sector body, you shall consult with the Director General of the CSO if you're going to amend a data collection activity. So there's actually a legal requirement on them. The private sector is a little bit different because you don't have that type of leverage, but it doesn't make it any less important, because I think that, especially just as Julio mentioned, we've had huge demands put on us in relation to the impact of the COVID-19 restrictions, and to assess that impact, we've had to access privately held data sources. And I think what we're going to have to work on there is a lot more kind of a collaborative approach, where, and our sense is that there was a kind of a social conscience built up very much across private data providers, whether it was around credit and debit card data, some aggregated data from mobile network operating companies, traffic flow information, all of that came from the private sector to us, obviously in aggregated anonymized format. The quality observations were, what we did actually was we looked at the data and we said, look, it mightn't be perfect, but there are valuable insights to be extracted from the data. And the most important thing for a National Statistical Institute is to be transparent about the data. So you need to say, yes, this data is of this quality, and we can certainly say that it tells you X, Y, and Z. But if you're using another data source, what users really appreciate is understanding the quality of that data source. It doesn't mean that if it's not perfect, it doesn't have insight. But what is important is that you're very clear with the users. And I think that that relationship can build over time. And that's what we'll have to do with the private sector, the private data holders.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point, and also comes back to some of the things we were talking about before around numeracy and literacy, is getting people to understand that, you know, data is not just this generic kind of massive information that's always of a certain quality or standard, but helping people understand this has come from the official statistical process and is, you know, held to this rigor and therefore valuable for these large scale insights. If you're responding to a crisis, by all means use this data, but it comes with the following provisos. And you know, having the NSO be a bit of a translator of that, I think is super helpful. Judasha, we've had a couple of interesting questions that have come in from audience members, one of which I wanted to ask you, which is, you know, you've talked about ensuring protection standards and guidelines. Are there any international data protection standards that you recommend, that you sort of hold as a really good example of how to establish these guidelines that countries or different actors can look to?
Definitely. Yes, definitely. I mean, we actually, if I can say it, our Data Protection Act itself is inspired from Convention 108 and certain provisions of the General Data Protection Regulation. Definitely, they are very good starting points to documents to look at if you think about making a very pragmatic and good data governance framework. But definitely, let me be very clear about it. These principles are very complex in nature. We just have to make them, you know, practical principles that can be implemented in the context. So the main important aspect would be to look around in other countries. What are the data governance frameworks that they have adopted, and whether we have UN principles also coming into play to make sure that these, you know, frameworks actually become very operational, because otherwise we have a set of principles and they are just principles. They don't really marry into the context. We don't really operate in practice. So basically, this is what we work on. This is what we have worked on. But we also offer guidance, if we can, to other people who are interested on how to make these frameworks happening, because we have developed this framework as well in collaboration with the public sector for Mauritius. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you so much, and helpful to know the specific references that you know, for those of us who are not experts in this area, can look to sort of see clarification of some of the language, some of the terminology, and try and make it a little bit more accessible. So thanks, Judasha. Julio, if I could turn to you again on this question of data protection. You have a very broad mandate. You're dealing with geographical and statistical and satellite imagery and kind of high resolution data, as well as, you know, other forms of traditional official statistics. Has data protection become a kind of priority concern for INEHI specifically over the last couple of years? And what are some of the measures that you've been taking on this topic specifically?
Well, yes, data protection is always an important concern. It's actually a legal mandate that we have to retain confidentiality of all the data sources that were the private data that we actually collect. Obviously, geospatial information brings different aspects, because with these high resolution images that you were talking, we have to be very careful of certain elements that can be very invasive of privacy in certain aspects. So we have to deal very carefully in some of these respects. I mean, even there are certain aspects that are of national security that we cannot really disclose in terms of imagery, and it's always very understood. But As a practical example, for instance, we just released our economic census. And the economic census, given the economic structure of Mexico, where we have very highly concentrated industries, we have to have clear procedures for anonymization of the data so that users cannot actually identify some of the economic units and enterprises that relate to certain data. So we have to come up with certain data protection assurances and algorithms that have the ability to protect to a greater extent the data that we're actually publishing, Jessica.
Fabulous, thank you so much. Yeah, that's really interesting. And hearing the point about, and I think previously we heard about the development of the NSO working to help develop policies and laws and so on, but also just having its own internal conditions around assurances, as you say, and being really clear about what those are is really important. So I'm going to take a step back now and just ask a little bit to all of you about what do you think is the most important thing that a data steward should do to kind of reach out and liaise with people from the private sector and producers outside of government? Is it a case of you wait for these third-party actors to come to you offering their goods, or has there been a real kind of effort to reach out to third-party data producers and find ways to collaborate and kind of try and establish a more practical working arrangement with some of these entities? How has it been working in practice? Padraig, to you first maybe, and then I'll jump to colleagues.
Thanks, Jessica. Well, I suppose, look, one of the things that we benefit from in Ireland is we're a relatively small country, so we know an awful lot of the actors, and we have very good relationships built up with a lot of these, what I would say, professional third-party compilers of statistics, and actually in many cases, they actually a lot of their work actually is based on data we collect directly ourselves. So they come to us looking for access, like research access. So like the research institutes, the institutes in academia, in the colleges, a lot of, they don't collect data themselves in very many cases. They come to us looking for data that we've collected. And also what's happening in Ireland is other government departments are now asking us to provide the legal framework to allow access to their data sources. So it's to try and ensure that we can maximize the usage of the data while satisfying, as Judisha has identified, the data protection piece, the data governance piece. And that comes back to what Julio was saying, is there's legal obligations on NSIs to ensure the confidentiality of data. So if we breach that confidentiality, we're in breach of the law. So I suppose that's that perspective. But I think that the private data and some of the private data pieces are, I think it's a really difficult challenge, Jessica, and I think there's a good bit of work to go in thinking around that, because one of the things that concerns me is the way in which the media seem to accept data without question as to where it has come from. Nobody asks simple questions like what's the sample size. Is the sample representative of the population it's supposed to be asking? But they don't ask questions like this anymore, and I don't know why that is. The world seems to be kind of, it's almost like fast food. Everything has to be now, and nobody's thinking about the cost of now. And I think the role for us as NSIs is to try and distinguish between alternative facts and real facts, and that's also going to require a little bit of leadership and bravery to ensure that our citizens, first of all, that our decision makers are making decisions based on good quality data. And secondly, that our citizens are living in an informed society where they're not basing their own decisions on alternative facts. So I don't have a clear answer, but I do see that it's a huge challenge. And I do think NSIs have an important role to play there in collaboration with our partners.
Thanks, Padraig. Sorry, I just had to, there seems to be a bit of interruption with my video. I don't know if anyone else is seeing that or whether it's just at my end. Okay, maybe it's just at my end. Thank you for those comments. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this goes back to the point that we were saying before, that there is this sort of lack of general numeracy, which is a real problem, I think, when the general public can't differentiate necessarily. Many can, don't get me wrong, of course, but some members of the general public, and certainly the media, have been perpetuating this problem, don't differentiate between the quality and sources of information. You know, and it is probably the discerning few who are going straight to their NSO to look at the latest COVID statistics rather than just Googling current death rate, you know, without actually looking at who's reporting it. So yes, I noticed we have Pam back, which is brilliant, because I wanted to give Pam a chance to jump in before we go to some more questions from the floor. Pam, sorry about your earlier connectivity issues. I'm glad you're back with us.
Yes, sorry about that.
That's okay. Do you want to jump in on any of the range of questions that we've been just reflecting on, or in fact just go back to this broader issue of the balance between kind of protection, quality assurance, and transparency?
Actually, I'm going to follow on with the comments that have just been coming in regarding secondary sources. It's really what I wanted to talk about. Secondary data sources are an extraordinarily challenging and difficult issue area. Make no mistake, that has not been fully solved yet, not even by a long shot. It's really tough. If you think very specifically, for example, about the pandemic, we've been using, for example, geolocation data from mobile phones, and that in and of itself, in another context, could be deeply controversial, as well as in some cases not necessarily legal, depending on your jurisdiction. This has been really discussed very deeply in data protection circles because this represents a very large data collection. Additionally, in many different countries, consumers' purchase histories are also used for quite a few statistical operations. For example, data sets of MasterCard or other types of purchases, I should say credit card purchases, etc. These data sets are well known and well established, and they're very revealing. So one of the issues here is, okay, which secondary data sources are acceptable to use and which should never be used? What is in between those two different levels of use or non-use? And then, is the data consented or unconsented? How do we want to deal with that? So it's a really complex issue, and it deserves a lot of cooperative work. In terms of the role of a data steward, it's to start to figure out some of these secondary use issues. Right now, throughout much of the world, there is a booming economy in the sale of secondary data. And we need to make sure that as we mature in our understanding of data and data ecosystems, that all of this becomes less Wild West and cowboy and much more regulated and with more guardrails. Thank you.
Thanks, Pam. Brilliant points. And absolutely, I mean, this is only going to be a growing issue and concern, I think, for the whole data statistical and ecosystem sort of worldwide. Again, I'm aware that we don't have that much time, and I'd like to give all of the speakers a chance to have a kind of concluding remark before we wrap up. So I'm going to go through all 6 of you in turn, if that's all right. And what I would love you to reflect on is there a key point or reflection or recommendation that you would have as we look to the Statistical Commission in a few weeks, and as we think about this new potential work programme around data stewardship and the role that the Commission could play in defining this new or encouraging this new sort of transition towards broader roles and functions of data ecosystems nationally? Is there a specific area of work or a specific recommendation you would like to put to the Statistical Commission in advance of that, and specifically to the working group they're planning to establish? So I'm going to jump back to Jean, who was our first speaker, and see if there's a particular recommendation that you'd like to put to this group, and any, of course, quick concluding remarks you might have. Thanks, Jean.
Sure. Well, it's an honor learning from everybody, and thank you so much for putting it together. I think the one thing I would want to emphasize is that we should be inclusive in our work with the ecosystem. So often, especially National Statistics Office, often think about people who have sort of the data science background or the statistician background. And we find that the most amazing stories and use of data sometimes come from the most unexpected sources. So to think broadly about this ecosystem, not just public-private partnerships, not just commercial organizations, or even academics, but the idea of our citizen scientists who are working with us on our NASA air quality data, the ability for young people to come in with different perspectives and ideas, and that inclusivity of how we really think about the way in which we use data and what we're really trying to do, which is empower people to make better decisions every day through the use of data. And not to do that in a way which puts them off, but to do that in a way which brings their voices as part of the conversation and helps us to understand how to create a more equitable world through the use of data. So I would just encourage all of us to think maybe a little broader about who we include in these conversations and making sure that we're bringing all the voices to the table.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you for that reminder that it's easy to get lost in the sort of the big macro debates about privacy and confidentiality and collaborations with the Googles of this world, but actually, you know, so much of this is about, you know, kind of communicating with our residents and citizens and understanding what they need and what they want and what they understand is the function and purpose of this information. So thank you, a very good point. Pam, I'll come to you next.
Yes, I'll just make 3 brief points here. I'd say I would really love to see very specific guidelines as to how the various stakeholders can cooperate in a regular and repeatable way that is mirrored across jurisdictions, so we can build more of a global ecosystem, not just jurisdictional, but global. And then secondly, how to reliably make good decisions about secondary data. This decision-making area is extraordinarily complex and really does need a lot of work, fresh eyes and new work on it. I think it's very important. And then thirdly, and this goes back to some earlier comments, I think it's absolutely imperative that we figure out how to train our communities to both understand and utilize the data that is there about them. Because in the end, we've got to have top down and bottom up. And in that way, hopefully we will have a lot of people within the next decade who have much more numeracy. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Pam. Brilliant. A very specific and helpful suggestion there. I'm going to do my best to try and summarize these at the end, but we'll just speed through all of our speakers first. Risenga, I cannot see you anymore, but I hope you're still on the line. Risenga, did you want to share a concluding thought or recommendation as we go into the Statistical Commission in a few weeks?
Certainly, one of the things we need to look at is the whole issue into non-traditional data. We in the NSOs are used to have data that we control, and sometimes when it's not structured, we do create an environment through which we can structure it. The world in which we are living, which is churning out data on a daily basis, does say to us that we'll be getting a lot of unstructured data. And we need to deploy artificial intelligence and other forms and techniques to get this data structured. So that's the first point. The second point is that we need more data points. The more the data points, the more clearer the picture is, especially in decision making that is rapid and highly pressurized. The last point I want to raise is, again, the deployment of artificial intelligence and machine learning and other facilities to make sure that we have lessons for the future in case we are hit by other challenges, because we didn't see this one coming in the form of the COVID-19. And surely there will be many more other challenges at the global level. But even if these challenges are localized, the world must be able to have facilities and techniques through which we can move speedily and save lives. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think preparedness and anticipation of future functions and the kinds of demands that might be placed on data and information systems is absolutely crucial and is brought into sharp relief in this current crisis. Thank you, Risenga. We'll now jump to Patrick.
Sorry, Jessica, just a second. Yeah, I suppose I always like to start with the question is, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And I think that that's really, really important. And I like a quote from a UN report, actually, a number of years, A World That Counts. And the quote was simple: data is the lifeblood of decision making and the raw material for accountability. So I think collectively, we all recognize the fact that if we are to provide the insight that both decision makers and citizens need, we have to, as Reshape has said, we have to use both traditional data sources and non-traditional data sources. And I think Pam has mentioned in particular one of the challenges around that, and it's really this balance between data access and data protection, and where you draw that line and how you draw that line. And I think one of the benefits of national statistical institutes being involved is that official statistics holds a very specific role even within the world of data protection. If you look at Article 89 of the General Data Protection Regulation, there are very clear exemptions in there because there's a recognition of the value of official statistics. So official statisticians have to provide data that's relevant. But to do it, we have to gain access to the relevant data while adhering to all of the appropriate data governance and data protection requirements. And to do that, I think we have to start talking to each other a lot more. We have to understand each other's perspectives and each other's concerns, because I'm quite certain that everybody wants the same outcome. But the question is, we haven't worked out yet how to get there. And I think that's a block of work that needs to happen. And the last thing, Jessica, just to say is, we're not all at the same point in terms of a data stewardship role. Every country is at a different stage of the evolution of its data ecosystem. So I think it's really important that it's difficult to do this on a global level. We all have to recognize where we are in our own national systems and to build from there. But I think a common challenge for all of us is going to be addressing this piece between data access and at the same time protecting the privacy of the individual's data. But I think we can do it if we work together, but I think it's a big challenge.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Patrick, and for taking that step back to remind us of the kind of overarching challenge and question we're trying to solve here. Trudasha, some thoughts or reflections from you for the Statistical Commission in a few weeks?
Yes, definitely. I have really enjoyed this conversation because we have all been talking about data protection. And all of us here, we're talking about data and how to protect data. So I'm very happy about it. And I think the ambition and what we're looking forward in this discussion is good quality data optimization. To sum up the whole issue is it's not that complicated. It's not so difficult to achieve this ambition. But the UN Statistical Commission definitely plays a pivotal role in achieving this particular function together with us people here around this table. Data protection principles are very simple principles, and we need to have a document with these underlying principles, which defines the role of a data steward. I mean, what are we looking up to in data stewardship? It's not only about a person who is being designated to perform, security controls, to analyze data or to produce data and to bring results. It's a very broad function which covers every aspect of data, ranging from data integrity, data transparency, to data disaggregation, and any name that you will join in the process. So you understand that it's not going to be something that is going to be left to the statistics department to do, but it has to look up to an overarching policy which covers each and every aspect which might come into play in relation to statistical information. So basically, this is what I've got to say. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Trudasha. That's a brilliant point. And I think, it goes to show that the Statistical Commission, when they embark on this program of work, has got to really take a very broad view of kind of how we're defining this ecosystem and all the different relevant component parts that might interact with the use of this kind of information for in various different levels for protection and for insights and so on. Julio, I'm going to give the concluding remark to you before I do a very quick summary. So any particular thoughts or recommendations you would have for the Statistical Commission meeting in a few weeks to think about taking forward this data stewardship work program?
Thank you, Jessica. I will pick on judicious last point, I think a suggestion for the Statistical Commission is to look to the fundamental principles of official statistics with a data stewardship perspective. That may require to modify certain of the principles. It may require additional principles, or it may require a completely different set of principles regarding data stewardship. So I think that's a task that the Statistical Commission has to think about. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Julio. So I can't possibly do justice to this whole discussion, but just a few reflections from me. I mean, I think it was summarized very nicely towards the end there by Padraig and Judesha, who said, you know, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And it's really about the balance between this data access and data protection and how you draw the line, and making sure that across the whole ecosystem of data information, we're looking for good quality data optimization. A couple of themes I think have come out really strongly have been around equity, collaboration and inclusion, particularly stressed by Jean at the beginning. You know, it's not just about public-private partnerships and these kind of large-scale collaborations. It's also about how you engage citizens, how you make them understand how they can use data to make better everyday decisions in their own lives, and how we make sure that we encourage the better data literacy and understanding amongst a wide range of different communities. The media, of course, was cited, but you know, I think there's a range of different communities that we could do with better outreach too, so they understand the kinds of different quality and information that is available out there with all the big data producers. Another point that was raised is around the necessity for the National Statistical Office and the National Statistical System to think about providing services. You know, thinking about mandates and functions, this is about trying to provide useful outputs and data for public policy and for decision making. And that might mean evolving services somewhat. So thinking about kind of, as Padraig highlighted, providing services like analysis of structuring of unstructured data. You cited the great example of Ireland's COVID-19 data hub and doing some sort of third-party data analytics. So I think kind of thinking about how evolving services of the NSO might be changing. But in all of that, another key theme, of course, has been data quality, and thinking about, as Reshenga put it, maintaining trusted third-party data managers and making sure that quality is critical. I liked your quote, Reshenga, when you said we have to be soft on rules but adhere to standards, to try and encourage as many people as possible to kind of come together and to collaborate, but then ensure that there are some quality standards to make sure that we're actually maintaining a certain, you know, a quality of public sector output, of public data output, and that, you know, we're using as much information as possible, but very clear and very explicit about what some of the limitations of some of those inputs might be. And then I think a final category of kind of functions that was discussed was around the necessity for the NSO and the statistical system to think about being more involved in helping to write policies and standards that facilitate better management of data across the government. And we heard some great practical examples of things like appointments of data protection officers across all organizations in the country, as in Mauritius, or just within different ministries and departments, and other ways to ensure data protection assurances and make sure that different aspects of the government are making really good decisions using secondary data. So brilliant points raised by all. Thank you so much. It's brilliant, fabulous discussion. There will be a summary of this debate available in advance of the 57th of the Statistical Commission. And we would encourage you all to look out for the summary of the discussion on agenda item 3A, which is on data and indicators for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as well as to read the brilliant report of the high-level group, which has loads of case studies from many of the countries we've heard present here today. So thank you once again. It's been a pleasure to have you all on the line, and I'm wishing you all a healthy and happy rest of your day and week, and stay well in the context of this difficult time. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you indeed.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.